Ladies and gentlemen, the drum roll. Here we are with the reading cow for another world, for another thrilling and exciting, inimitable, inestimably brilliant episode of a chapter of a section of the Legends of the Jews, brought to us by Louis Ginsberg. All right. So, in this installment, we're gonna continue on the topic of the first cutting of the foreskin to show a permanent, indelible mark of something. Uh, uh, do people show that? Anyway, okay. So this is a story, folks, how it all began. So join us again in this next thrilling episode as we begin with the visit of the angels on the third day after circumcision. Ouch. When Abraham was suffering dire pain, God spoke to the angel, saying, "Go to, let us pay a visit to the sick." The angels refused and said, "Oh, what is man that thou art mindful of him?" They're always saying that. "And the Son of Man that thou visitest him, and thou desirest to betake thyself to a place of uncleanness, a place of blood and filth." But God replied unto them, "Thus do ye speak, as ye live. The savor of this blood is sweeter to me than myrrh and incense. And if you do not desire to visit Abraham, I will go alone." The day whereon God visited him was exceedingly hot, for he he had bored a hole in hell, so that its heat might reach as far as the earth, and no wayfarer venture abroad on the highways. And Abraham be left undisturbed in his pain. I bet you didn't know that. On the day that Abraham, after he cut his thing and he was in a lot of pain, God literally bored a hole down into hell to make the world get very hot, so nobody would go out on the road and make noise to disturb Abraham. You can't make this stuff up, folks. Yeah, yeah. You know why? Because somebody already made it up. But the absence of stranger caused Abraham great vexation. In other words, it backfired. And he sent his servant Eliezer forth to keep a lookout for travelers. When the servant returned from his fruitless search, Abraham himself, in spite of his illness and the scorching heat, prepared to go forth on the highway and see whether he could not succeed where a failure had attended Eliezer, whom he did not wholly trust, at any rate, bearing in mind the well known saying, "No truth among." This day is not going well for me. No truth among slaves. At this moment, God appeared to him surrounded by the angels. Wow. Bling! Quickly, Abraham attempted to rise from his seat, but God checked every demonstration of respect. And when Abraham protested that it was unbecoming to sit in the presence of the Lord, God said, "As thou livest, thy descendants at the age of 4 and 5 will sit in days to come in the schools and in the synagogues, while I reside therein." Meantime, Abraham beheld 3 men. They were the angels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Raphael. They had assumed the form of human beings to fulfill his wish for guests toward whom to exercise hospitality. Each of them had been charged by God with a special mission, besides to be executed on earth. Raphael was to heal the wound of Abraham. Michael was to bring Sarah the glad tidings that she would bear a son. Big job, folks. And Gabriel was to deal destruction to Sodom and Gomorrah. Arrived at the tent of Abraham, the 3 angels noticed that he was occupied in nursing himself, and they withdrew. Abraham, however, hastened after them through another door of the tent, which had wide open entrances on all sides. He considered the duty of hospitality more important than the duty of receiving the Shekinah. Turning to God, he said, "O Lord, may it please thee not to leave thy servant while he provides for the entertainment of his guests." Then he addressed himself to the stranger walking in the middle between the other two, whom by this token he considered the most distinguished. It was the archangel Michael, and he bade him and his companions turn aside into his tent. The manner of his guests, who treated one another politely, made a good impression upon Abraham. He was assured that they were men of worth whom he was entertaining. But as they appeared outwardly like Arabs, and the people worshipped the dust of their feet, he bade them first wash their feet, that they might not defile his tent. He did not depend upon his own judgment in reading the character of his guest. By his tent a tree was planted, which spread its branches out over all who believed in God and afforded them shade. But if idolaters went under the tree, the branches. So we were cut off. Uh, I'm just gonna check. Yeah, I got audio. My disk filled up there, folks. But I'm back. Never fear. Okay, so Abraham, he had a tree by his tents. He did not depend upon his own judgment in reading the character of his guests. By his tent a tree was planted, which spread its branches out over all who believed in God and afforded them shade. But if idolaters went under the tree, the branches turned upward and cast no shade upon the ground. Whenever Abraham saw this sign, he would at once set about the task of converting the worshippers of the false gods. And as the tree made the distinction between the pious and the impious, so also between the clean and the unclean. Its shade was denied them as long as they refrained from taking the prescribed ritual bath in the spring that flowed out from its roots, the waters of which rose at once for those whose uncleanness was of a venial character and could be removed forthwith, while others had to wait 7 days for the water to come up. Accordingly, Abraham bade the 3 men lean against the trunk of the tree. Thus he would soon learn their worth or their unworthiness. Being of the truly pious, who promise little but perform much, Abraham said only, "I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your heart, seeing that ye chance to pass my tent at dinner time. Then, after ye have given thanks to God, you may pass on." But when the meal was served to the guest, it was a royal banquet, exceeding Solomon's at the time of his most splendid magnificence. Think about it. Abraham himself ran unto the herd to fetch cattle for meat. He slaughtered 3 calves that he might be able to set a tongue with mustard before each of his guests. In order to accustom Ishmael to God-pleasing deeds, he had him dress the calves, and he bade Sarah bake the bread. But as he knew that women are apt to treat guests niggardly, he was explicit in his request to her. He said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of meal, yea, fine meal as it happened The bread was not brought to the table because it had accidentally become unclean, and our father Abraham was accustomed to eat his daily bread only in a clean state. Abraham himself served as guests, and it appeared to him that the three men ate. But this was an illusion. In reality, the angels did not eat. Only Abraham, his three friends Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, and his son Ishmael partook of the banquet, and the portions set before the angels were devoured by a heavenly fire. Although the angels remained angels, even in their human disguise, nevertheless, the personality of Abraham was so exalted that in his presence the archangels felt insignificant. After the meal, the angels asked after Sarah, though they knew that she was in retirement in her tent. But it was proper for them to pay their respects to the lady of the house and send her the cup of wine over which the blessing had been said. Michael, the greatest of the angels, thereupon announced the birth of Isaac. He drew a line upon the wall, saying, "When the sun crosses this point, Sarah will be with child, and when he crosses the next point, she will give birth to a child." This communication, which was intended for Sarah and not for Abraham, to whom the promise had been revealed long before, the angels made at the entrance to her tent. But Ishmael stood between the angel and Sarah, for it would not have been seemly to deliver the message in secret, with none other by. Yet so radiant was the beauty of Sarah that a beam of it struck the angel and made him look up. In the act of turning toward her, he heard her laugh within herself. Is it possible that these bowels can yet bring forth a child? These shriveled breasts give suck? And though I should be able to bear, yet is not my lord Abraham old? And the Lord said unto Abraham, Am I too old to do wonders? And wherefore doth Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which am old? The reproach made by God was directed against Abraham as well as against Sarah, for he too had showed himself of little faith when he was told that a son would be born unto him. But God mentioned only Sarah's incredulity, leaving Abraham to become conscious of his defect himself. Regardful of the peace of their family life, God had not repeated Sarah's words accurately to Abraham. Abraham might have taken amiss what his wife had said about his advanced years, and so precious is the peace between husband and wife that even the Holy One, blessed be He, preserved it at the expense of truth. After Abraham had entertained his guests, he went with them to bring them on their way. For important as the duty of hospitality is, the duty of speeding the parting guests is even more important. Get out of here! Mm. Their way lay in the direction of Sodom, whither two of the angels were going, the one to destroy it, and the second to save Lot, while the third, his errand to Abraham fulfilled, returned to heaven. Bling! The cities of sin. Oh no. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah and the three other cities of the plain were sinful and godless. In their country there was an extensive vale where they foregathered annually with their wives and children and all belonging to them to celebrate a feast lasting several days and consisting of the most revolting orgies. If a stranger merchant passed through their territory, he was besieged by them all, big and little alike, and robbed of whatever he possessed. Each one appropriated a bagatelle until the traveler was stripped bare. If the victim ventured to remonstrate with one or another, he would show him that he had taken a mere trifle, not worth talking about. And the end was that they hounded him from the city. Once upon a time it happened that a man journeying from Elam arrived in Sodom toward evening. No one could be found to grant him shelter for the night. Finally, a sly fox named Hador invited him cordially to follow him to his house. The Sodomite had been attracted by a rarely magnificent carpet strapped to the stranger's ass by means of a rope. He meant to secure it for himself. The friendly persuasions of Hador induced the stranger to remain with him 2 days, though he had expected to stay only overnight. When the time came for him to continue on his journey, he asked his host for the carpet and the rope. Hador said, "Thou hast dreamed a dream, and this is the interpretation of thy dream. The rope signifies that thou wilt have a long life, as long as a rope. The varicolored carpet indicates that thou wilt own an orchard wherein thou wilt plant all sorts of fruit trees." Think about it. The stranger insisted that his carpet was a reality, not a dream fancy, and he continued to demand its return. "Give me that stuff back, man. That's my stuff. Give it back." Not only did Hedora deny having taken anything from his guest, he even insisted upon pay for having interpreted his dream to him. "Hey, you can't just get free dream interpretation around here. You gotta, cough up some shekels." Yeah. His usual price for such services, he said, was 4 silver pieces, but in view of the fact that he was his guest, he would, as a favor to him, content himself with 3 pieces of silver. After much wrangling, they put their cases before one of the judges of Sodom, Sherek by name, and he said to the plaintiff, "Hador is known in this city as a trustworthy interpreter of dreams, and what he tells thee is true." The stranger declared himself not satisfied with the verdict, and continued to urge his side of the case. Then Sherek drove both the plaintiff and the defendant from the courtroom. Seeing this, the inhabitants gathered together and chased the stranger from the city, and lamenting the loss of his carpet, he had to pursue his way. They ripped me off. I'm so angry. Yeah. As Sodom had a judge worthy of itself, so also had the other cities, Sharkar and Gomorrah, Zabnak and Admah and Manon and Zeboim. Eliezer, the bondman of Abraham, made slight changes in the names of these judges in accordance with the nature of what they did. The first he called Shakara, liar. The second, Shakrura, arch deceiver. The third, Kazban, falsifier. And the fourth, Mazuldin, perverter of judgment. At the suggestion of these judges, the city set up beds on their commons. When a stranger arrived, 3 men seized him by his head and 3 by his feet, and they forced him upon one of the beds. If he was too short to fit into it exactly, his 6 attendants pulled and wrenched his limbs until he filled it out. If he was too long for it, they tried to jam him in with all their combined strength until the victim was on the verge of death. His outcries were met with the words, "Thus will be done to any man who comes into our land, that comes into our land." After a while, the travelers avoided these cities, but if some poor devil was betrayed occasionally into entering them, they would give him gold and silver, but never any bread, so that he was bound to die of starvation. Once he was dead, the residents of the cities came and took back the marked gold and silver which they had given him. They would quarrel about the distribution of his clothes, for they would bury him naked. Once Eliezer, the bondman of Abraham, went to Sodom at the bidding of Sarah to inquire after the welfare of Lot. He happened to enter the city at the moment when the people were robbing a stranger of his garments. Eliezer espoused the cause of the poor wretch, and the Sodomites turned against him. One threw a stone at his forehead and caused considerable loss of blood. Instantly the assailant, seeing the blood gush forth, demanded payment for having performed the operation of cupping. Think about it. Eliezer refused to pay for the infliction of a wound upon him, and he was haled before the judge Shakara. The decision went against him, for the law of the land gave the assailant the right to demand payment. Eliezer quickly picked up a stone and threw it at the judge's forehead. When he saw that the blood was flowing profusely, he said to the judge, "Pay my debt to the man and give me the balance." Yeah, I'm sure that went over really well. The cause of their cruelty was their exceeding great wealth. Their soil was gold, and in their miserliness and their greed for more and more gold, they wanted to prevent strangers from enjoying aught of their riches. Accordingly, they flooded the highways with streams of water, so that the roads to their city were obliterated, and none could find the way thither. They were as heartless toward beasts as towards men. They begrudged the birds what they ate, and therefore extirpated them. They behaved impiously toward one another, too, not shrinking back from murder to gain possession of more gold. If they observed that a man owned great riches, two of them would conspire against him. They would beguile him to the vicinity of the ruins, and while one kept him on the spot by pleasant converse, the other would undermine the wall near which he stood, until it suddenly crashed down upon him and killed him. Then the two plotters would divide his wealth between them. It's pretty tricky, gotta admit. Another method of enriching themselves with the property of others was in vogue among them. They were adroit thieves. When they made up their minds to commit theft, they would first ask their victim to take care of a sum of money for them, which they smeared with strongly scented oil before handing it over to him. The following night they would break into his house and rob him of his secret treasures, led to the place of concealment by the smell of the oil. Their laws were calculated to do injury to the poor. The richer a man, the more was he favored before the law. The owner of 2 oxen was obliged to render 1 day's shepherd service, but if he had 1 ox, he had to give 2 days' service. A poor orphan, who was thus forced to tend the flocks a longer time than those who were blessed with large herds, killed all the cattle entrusted to him in order to take revenge upon his oppressors, and he insisted, when the skins were assigned, that the owner of 2 head of cattle should have but 1 skin, but the owner of 1 head should receive 2 skins, in correspondence to the method pursued in assigning the work. For the use of a ferry, a traveler had to pay 4 zuz, but if he waded through the water, he had to pay 8 zuz. Think about it. The cruelty of the Sodomites went still further. Lot had a daughter, Paltit, so named because she had been born to him shortly after he escaped captivity through the help of Abraham. Paltit lived in Sodom, where she had married. Once a beggar came to town, and the court issued a proclamation that none should give him anything to eat, in order that he might die of starvation. But Paltit had pity upon the unfortunate wretch, and every day, when she went to the well to draw water, she supplied him with a piece of bread, which she hid in her water pitcher. The inhabitants of the 2 sinful cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, could not understand why the beggar did not perish, and they suspected that someone was giving him food in secret. 3 men concealed themselves near the beggar, and called Paltit in the act of giving him something to eat. She had to pay for her humanity with death. She was burnt upon a funeral pyre. Ah, terrible. The people of Admah were no better than those of Sodom. Once a stranger came to Admah intending to stay overnight and continue his journey the next morning. The daughter of a rich man met the stranger and gave him water to drink and bread to eat at his request. When the people of Admah heard of this infraction of the law of the land, they seized the girl and arraigned her before the judge, who condemned her to death. The people smeared her with honey from top to toe and exposed her where bees would be attracted to her. The insects stung her to death, as was their wont, and the callous people paid no heed to her heart-rending cries. Then it was that God resolved upon the destruction of these sinners. Abraham pleads for the sinners. When God saw that there was no righteous man among the inhabitants of the sinful cities, and there would be none among their descendants, for the sake of whose merits the rest might be treated with lenient consideration, he resolved to annihilate them one and all. But before judgment was executed, the Lord made known unto Abraham what he would do to Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other cities of the plain, for they form a part of Canaan, the land promised unto Abraham. And therefore did God say, I will not destroy them without the consent of Abraham. There you go. There you have it. Like a compassionate father, Abraham importuned the grace of God in behalf of the sinners. He spoke to God and said, Thou didst take an oath that no more should all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Is it meet that thou shouldst evade thy oath and destroy cities by fire? Shall the judge of all the earth not do right himself? Verily, If thou desirest to maintain the world, thou must give up the strict line of justice. If thou insistest upon the right alone, there can be no world. Whereupon God said to Abraham, Thou takest delight in defending my creatures, and thou wouldst not call them guilty. Therefore I spoke with none but thee during the 10 generations since Noah. Abraham ventured to use still stronger words in order to secure the safety of the godless. That be far from thee, he said, to slay the righteous with the wicked, that the dwellers of the earth say not. It is his trade to destroy the generations of men in a cruel manner, for he destroyed the generation of Enosh, then the generation of the flood, and then he sent the confusion of tongues. He sticks ever to his trade. God made reply, I will let all the generations I have destroyed pass before thee, that thou mayest see they have not suffered the extreme punishment they deserved. But if thou thinkest that I did not act justly, then instruct thou me in what I must do, and I will endeavor to act in accordance with thy words. And Abraham had to admit that God had not diminished in aught the justice due to every creature in this world or the other world. Nevertheless, he continued to speak, and he said, Wilt thou consume the cities if there be 10 righteous men in each? And God said, No, if I find 50 righteous therein, I will not destroy the cities. Abraham, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, who I would have been turned long since into dust if the ground by Amraphel, and into ashes by Nimrod, had it not been for thy grace. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous for Zoar, the smallest of the 5 cities. Wilt thou destroy all the city for the lack of 5? God says, I will not destroy it if I find there 40 and 5. Abraham, peradventure there be 10 pious in each of the 4 cities. Then forgive Zoar in thy grace, for its sins are not so great in number as the sins of the others. God granted his petition, yet Abraham continued to plead, and he asked whether God would not be satisfied if there were but 30 righteous, 10 in each of the 3 larger cities, and would pardon the 2 smaller ones, even though there were no righteous therein, whose merits would intercede for them. This too the Lord granted, and furthermore, he promised not to destroy the cities if but 20 righteous were found therein. Yes, God conceded that he would preserve the 5 cities for the sake of 10 righteous therein. More than this Abraham did not ask, for he knew that 8 righteous ones, Noah and his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives, had not sufficed to avert the doom of the generation of the flood. And furthermore, he hoped that Lot, his wife, and their 4 daughters, together with the husbands of their daughters, would make up the number 10. What he did not know was that even the righteous in these sin-laden cities, though better than the rest, were far from good. Abraham did not cease to pray for the deliverance of the sinners even after the Shekinah had removed from him. But his supplications and his intercessions were in vain. For 52 years God had warned the godless. He had made mountains to quake and tremble, but they hearkened not unto the voice of admonition. They persisted in their sins, and their well-merited punishment overtook them. God forgives all sins, only not an immoral life. And as all these sinners led a life of debauchery, they were burnt with fire. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the section of the episode of the interval of the next chapter of the history of the universe and from the reading cow of another world, the show, bedtime stories thing that this is. Tune in again next time for the thrilling, inimitable, inestimable, incomparable story of the destruction of the sinful cities Until then, folks, goodbye.